it is an honour to be asked to speak at the formal opening of this hugely impressive library dedicated to the late great James Connolly in RC Connolly. Many of you are familiar with the life story of this extraordinary socialist agitator, writer and anti-imperialist revolutionary. Indeed, we are surrounded here by the volumes of the work he published during his, quote, full life, as he described it to his wife Lily, in the final days and hours before his execution by a British Army firing squad in Kilmainham Jail in Dublin on the 12th of May 1916. Connolly was of course killed not just for his role in organising the Easter Rising, as commander in the GPO of the Irish Volunteers and members of the Irish Citizen Army, who combined during those weeks to form the Irish Republican Army. It was also because he was a threat to the capitalist class due to his work in building the trade union movement in Ireland since his arrival here from Edinburgh, where he was born to Irish immigrants in Cowgate on 5th of June 1868. Connolly's two major works are Labour and Irish History, published in 1910, and The Reconquest of Ireland, finished in 1915, just months before his death. But during his relatively short life, he wrote, as Jim said, many essays, articles, pamphlets, songs, and poetry, some of which were later printed in book form as collected works. There has been so much written about James Connolly that the bibliography referencing them takes up 24 pages in Donald Nevin's authoritative biography published in 2005. It's on the top shelf there. In 2018, as head of communications with SIPTU, I arranged the republication of a biography of her father by Ina Connolly Heron, first serialised over several months in the Union newspaper Liberty on the 50th anniversary of the Rising in 1966. I think it, along with the book written by her sister, Nora Connolly, is among the most informative and insightful of the dozens of books and biographies of James Connolly. Ina noted how Connolly and his older brother John, who died fighting with the British Army in the First World War and was buried with full military honours in Glasgow, were buried within a month of each other. She quoted, Truly the British were masters of irony, to execute one brother in May as a revolutionary and bury the other in June with all the pomp at their command, she wrote. Ina inherited something of her father's gift and style of writing, not least her ability to record details of a tough family life with precision and humour, and in the language of her time. Her father started work at the age of 10 as a printer's devil, or gopher, as we call it now, in Edinburgh, later following his brother into the British Army and getting stationed in Cork and Dublin. When he missed a tram for Dalkey on Merrion Square one day, he met another, quote, tardy passenger, a fair young lady, whom, as Ina described, he drew into conversation as they waited for the next one. She asks, Ina wrote, I wonder what sparked his interest in her. Perhaps it was when she told of her granduncle, who was hanged during the Rising of 1798, because although a Protestant, he had taken part in the fighting with Michael Dwyer, who of course was the leader of the United Irishmen in Wexford and in County Wicklow, where Lily was born and reared. Ina continued, years later, whenever things weren't going smoothly, father would throw up his arms and say with tender mockery, oh, why did I miss that tram? Going smoothly, I would imagine, would not be an accurate description of the Connolly household on an average day. In a letter to Lily after his return to Edinburgh, and while she worked in Perth before they were married, he wrote, it is such a long time since we met, but I trust this time we will meet to part no more. Won't it be pleasant? By the way, if we get married next week, I shall be unable to go to Dundee, as I promised my fellow workmen in the job. I and my fellow workmen in the job are preparing to strike on the end of this month for a reduction in the hours of labour. As my brother and I are ringleaders in the matter, it is necessary we should be on the ground. So I imagine the dress was left in the wardrobe for another while. But as Ina concluded, I have always thought it the hallmark of my mother's character that she should accept the hand of a man who could mention wedding plans and a strike action in the same letter. I mention this particular extract from Ina's account because it touches on another of Connolly's written work that has only come to light in recent years. In her biography of her father, Portrait of a Rebel Father, published in 1935 by Ina's older sister, Nora Connolly O'Brien, there is a recollection of a conversation that her parents had in New York after they went to live there in 1904. Speaking to James, Lily refers to his play, The Agitator's Wife, which he wrote during their early years together when he worked as a union organiser in Edinburgh and Dundee. The play, as it was referred to, was listed in Nevin's biography and elsewhere as, quote, written in America, script presumed lost, end quote. In 2019, I received a call in Liberty Hall from researchers at the University of Glasgow who said they had found an original copy of The Agitator's Wife. The manuscript was unearthed sometime earlier in the archives of the University of Warwick, where librarians discovered that it was published anonymously as a short story in a Christian socialist journal called the Labour Prophet in February 1894. The story, which therefore must have been written around that period, before 1894, the story describes how the wife of a trade union agitator, as Connolly was widely known, takes over the running of a strike on the docks in Dundee, where workers were seeking better paying conditions after her husband falls ill. It's interesting, the reference before they got married to a dispute in Dundee. Anyway, their child in the story, the agitator's wife, their child is also near death's door. So, go back over that. The story tells how the wife of the agitator, trade union official, takes over the running of the strike on the docks. Jim will be familiar with this, where workers were seeking better paying condition after her husband falls ill. Their child is also near death's door, and the doctor cares for them both, while she successfully rallies the workers and local community to win their dispute. In the conversation recalled by Nora, where she hears the first reference to this so-called play, Lily talks about their difficulty in putting down their roots, a difficulty linked to Connolly's political activism and the reason for the family's itinerant existence. Nora recalled, "They were living in New York. It seems to be our fate," said Mama when they were packing, "never to spend 5 years in any one place. What's the use of building up a home when you know that it's bound to be broken up again? The play you wrote, The Agitator's Wife, is just about our life, isn't it?" "Yes," said Daddy, laughing, "but I made the wife say things you never said, Lily, though I'm sure you often felt them." For most of their lives, Lily and James Connolly lived in straitened circumstances with a young family from their early years together. Their first 3 children, Mona, Nora and Aideen, were born in Edinburgh. Not surprisingly, with small children to care for, Lily did not participate in public gatherings addressed by her husband so much, but she was active in other ways. Their home in Lothian Street became a centre for socialist meetings. Lily had received a better formal education than James, and she worked with him on his political speeches and writings over their years together. His arrival in Ireland is recorded in another important work by John Callow, again on the shelf there, who in 2013 republished James Connolly and the Reconquest of Ireland in a superbly illustrated production that is available here in the library. It includes a copy of a letter written by Scottish socialist John Leslie, who appealed in his column in the December 1895 edition of Justice, the name of the magazine, a small circulation but influential journal, for someone to give work to James Connolly. Leslie wrote how he knew of, quote, "very few men I have met during my life deserving of greater love and higher respect than Connolly. I have, after some difficulty," he wrote, "persuaded him to defer carrying out his intention of emigrating with a helpless family to Chile," spelled Chili. Connolly, who worked variously as a dustman, builder's labourer and cobbler, as well as a union organiser, as a result of this appeal by Leslie, was invited to Dublin by Adolphus Shields, the leader of the Gas Workers' Union and a socialist in the city. In May 1896, Connolly arrived with his family in Ireland to take up a job as organiser of the Dublin Socialist Club. He was also a member, of course, at the time of the Scottish Socialist Federation, with which Eleanor Marx, daughter of Karl Marx, whom Connolly often described as the greatest thinker of our times, and Friedrich Engels were also associated. As is widely known, he went on to form the Irish Socialist Republican Party, but still struggled to put food on the table during those first few years in Dublin, during which he met up with other radicals in the city. With Maud Gonne and the poet W.B. Yeats, of all people, he organised the anti-celebrations for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897. It was the sort of event with which you all be no doubt familiar, and after which Connolly was prosecuted for presiding at a seditious and riotous meeting and fined £2 or a month imprisonment. In 1902, he was invited to America for a lecture tour which finished in early 1903. After his return, his Labour and Socialist colleagues in the US offered him stable, paid employment for the first time as a union organiser, and he arranged for Lily and the family to join him there in 1904. Tragedy struck when his eldest child, Mona, with whom he was very close, died after she was accidentally burned in a fire at a house in Dublin, an incident movingly recalled by Ina, who witnessed the fatal accident. Connolly subsequently said that he made two great mistakes in his life. First in going to America, and second in returning therefrom. In his 1971 thesis, James Connolly in America, The Political Development of an Irish Marxist, as seen from his writings and his involvement with the American Socialist Movement, 1902 to 1910, the late Manus O'Riordan, who was never short for a few words, even in the titles, wrote of the intellectual battles that Connolly fought against what he perceived was the reformism of other leaders of the communist and socialist movement in the US. In his day job, he first worked selling insurance while living in Troy in New York State, where he got to know the poorly paid, mainly women textile workers, before their jobs were made redundant by technology and unscrupulous employers. He went on to work in Newark in the Singer sewing machine factory and became known as a socialist and union organiser before moving on to the Bronx. He became an organiser for the Industrial Workers of the World, known as the Wobblies, while he agitated with the Socialist Party and edited at the same time the Irish socialist paper The Harp, which he printed in America, the organ of the Irish Socialist Federation in the US. In January 1910, 6 years after his arrival in the US, production of The Harp was transferred at his insistence to Dublin and into the capable editorship of Jim Larkin. Connolly prepared then to make his way back to Ireland, and in May 1911 to Belfast, where he was appointed as secretary of the recently formed Irish Transport and General Workers Union, which of course Larkin had organised around the Docklands in Dublin and then in Belfast. Later that year he was joined by Lily and the children settled in a house at 1 Glenalina Terrace, close to this building on the Falls Road. Connolly set up office at 112 Corporation Street, Belfast, which was to be his base for the remaining 5 years of his life. Many of you here know about Connolly in Belfast, his organising work, with again mainly women workers in the textile industry, his battles with employers as he sought to organise among the 40,000 mill girls working in atrocious conditions, his struggle against employers who used religion to divide their workforce, his campaign against the Home Rule Bill, his warnings about the dangers of sectarianism. As he did in the US, Connolly argued against the reformism of many in the socialist movement, and he directed similar arguments against the Belfast members of the Independent Labour Party and its leader and city councillor, William Walker, whose views he depicted as, quote, scarcely indistinguishable from imperialism. His experience in confronting sectarianism and those opposed to Irish self-determination and national independence in a political environment dominated by unionist employers, and indeed many socialists, whose first allegiance was to the British Empire rather than to the freedom of the working class in every country, is key to understanding Connolly's subsequent political direction. He insisted that true internationalism was based on the cooperation of free peoples and that socialism could never be achieved while Ireland was a colonial outpost of a greater power. Ina recalled how the slave conditions of the dockers, whom he was also organising into the Union, were replicated in the linen mills of Belfast, where women and children worked with dangerous machines in damp and dust which destroyed their health. Talking, laughing, singing, adjusting their hair and eating sweets were forbidden in the factories. He organised hundreds of mill girls into the Textile Workers Union, a new affiliate of the ITGWU, who commenced an all-out strike for improvement of their paying conditions, fighting police, union scabs and sectarian attacks along the way as he built the union. In my view, it was this experience that led him to confront the spectre of partition, which he rightly feared would divide the labour movement across the island. He took over a strike in Wexford in 2011 when its leader was jailed, and won recognition for the union in a dispute at the foundry that preceded the largest ever confrontation with employers in Ireland, which of course was the Dublin lockout of 1913. Though based in Belfast, he effectively took over the strike or the lockout when Jim Larkin was jailed, and managed to secure the transport leader's release as the employers of Dublin starved up to 100,000 workers and their families into submission. During this period he formed the Irish Citizen Army with Jack White, Sean O'Casey, Constance Markovich and others as a weapon to defend the locked out workers from the police and scabs who were working on behalf of William Martin Murphy, the owner of independent newspapers and some hotels, and other employers in the city. He also saw the Citizens' Army as an essential force in the pursuit of national independence and socialism. When the war started in 1914, the European War, soon after the lockout ended and Larkin departed for America, Connolly became acting General Secretary of the Union. His attempts with Larkin to build a new Irish Labour Party, which was formed on their proposal at the Congress of Trade Unions in 1912 and was dedicated to achieving an Ireland where the country's entire resources would be controlled by its working people, were overwhelmed by the scale of the challenge posed by the war and the threat of conscription of young workers from the slums of Dublin and the rest of the country into the British war machine. As early as 2014, Connolly engaged with those he believed were progressives within the Irish Volunteers and Sinn Féin, and organised their training in cooperation with members of the Citizen Army. He worked closely from that time with Pearse, Clark, Keant and others within the Irish Republican Brotherhood, who supported the trade unions in their battles against rapacious employers, unlike others, such as Arthur Griffith, within the broad nationalist movement. He met secretly with the IRB to plan an insurrection, which he argued was the only way to avoid the wholesale slaughter of young Irish workers on the fields of Europe. It is notable that the living and working conditions for the mass of people in Dublin, Belfast and other cities, and for those struggling on the land 100 years ago, contributed to the development of the revolutionary movement in a way that resonates today with the current housing and low pay crisis in much of the country. Through 1915, Connolly met privately with the Republican leadership in Liberty Hall and other locations, prepared the drafts of the proclamation, which was printed in the Union headquarters, and which he so clearly influenced, and prepared the Citizen Army to join with the Irish Volunteers when the time was right. In the weeks before the Rising on Easter Monday 1916, he wrote extensively in his newspaper, his weekly newspaper, The Workers' Republic, about the pending fight ahead, to such an extent that one wonders how the so-called intelligence chiefs in Dublin Castle missed all the warnings. On Palm Sunday, just over a week before the planned rising, he raised the flag of Ireland, a harp set against a green background, over Liberty Hall, and publicly announced this call to arms. On Easter Monday, the Irish Volunteers, that had ignored the countermanding order by Owen MacNeill, whom Connolly deeply distrusted, joined with the Irish Citizen Army to take the GPO and other strategic buildings in Dublin. The flag that I referred to, the flag of Ireland, was seized as a trophy of war by the Inniskillings Fusiliers after Liberty Hall was bombarded from the English battleship the Helga on the Liffey and from the artillery across the river 2 days into the Rising. In February 2016, the flag was discovered in a box in the Inniskillings Museum in Enniskillen and was returned to Liberty Hall, quote, on loan by its trustees, just in time for the 100th anniversary of the Rising. It has been on display in the Union building since then, and I can assure you it'll stay at home. As Desmond Greaves concluded in perhaps the most important biography of this extraordinary revolutionary, Connolly was one of the first working class intellectuals. He was one of the most tireless and dedicated socialist workers who ever lived. He is still the subject of controversy because the issues he raised are still alive. Never a truer word, and still so relevant today. In my view, as we consider the potential for a new united Ireland, an end to partition, and to the 100 years of subjugation of working people on the island, their basic human rights to decent homes and decent lives ignored, we should continue to celebrate the full life of James Connolly and his contribution to the struggle for national independence and freedom. His ideas have never been so important.